Hey there kids, it's not your dad, but your Loredad, here to bring you a Project Stresa special episode. I've been working hard on German October and another very secret project, but I felt like I had to make something Project Stresa related. Recently, there's been a lot of fan content made for the Talons and Twilight Nation roleplay. It's been really great seeing how people have been really enjoying Talons and Twilight, and Project Stresa in general. So I thought that I would encourage this by letting people make their own timelines and show me what they've made. I held a contest on my server and the Alternate History Guild, where we challenged people to take an event that happens in Project Stresa, change it, and then move forward from there until you make your own scenario. We let everybody vote on which ones are the best, and I'm excited to look at our winners. But before we get into that, I wanted to share with you guys a little behind the scenes of Project Stresa, how I actually got to the point where I did episode 15, and all the different paths that made me eventually choose the outcome that came out. I'm really looking forward to sharing these with you, and if you're interested in more Project Stresa content, please let me know in the comments. Project Stresa is 15 episodes long, with a 2.5 hour long movie. But what if I told you that my first conception of Stresa was only around 3 episodes? The original idea for Project Stresa was that the deal that the Soviets offered the Germans, the Rump State Poland deal, was actually taken. While in Stresa's canon timeline this proposal was ignored, in the original timeline it was supposed to have been taken. This would have had several significant consequences for Europe. While Germany may not need to fear a second front of the war manifesting, the chain of alliances triggering in their favor would not occur. Romania would not honor their alliance with Poland or Yugoslavia, leading them to slowly become Latin Axis aligned. Czechoslovakia would remain neutral, and Hungarian Irredenta would only be partially satiated in order to gain their aid in the conflict. Not only this, but the Rump Poland would quickly turn to fascism, as national syndicalists would take over Poland and join the Latin Axis. With the Latin Axis expanding, and the Saxon allies only consisting of Britain, Germany, and Yugoslavia, the war would be quickly won by the Latin Axis. Britain would bow out of the conflict, as the French Navy's capabilities matched the British in proficiency, and the British lack any meaningful allies to rely upon. Thus, peace in Europe would be established by the Latin Axis, and Germany is shattered into pieces in the new order. It wouldn't take long before the French political situation stabilizes, and once there's secure leadership, France would endeavor to succeed where Napoleon failed by launching a massive invasion of the USSR. I decided not to go with this outcome, as it felt very similar to Thousand Week Reich, and I personally didn't find the idea of a fascist Europe particularly enjoyable to consider. That, and it ends too early, and gives the Latin Axis significant plot armor, ignoring all the issues that would have come with their political situations. So my next timeline's iteration had attempted to alleviate the deficiencies of the first, with having the Soviets manage to defeat Poland and Germany. In this second iteration, the proposal for a Rump Poland is not even considered, and instead, the Soviets simply march into Poland. The Saxon allies don't react, and the Soviets join with the Latin Axis in the partition of Germany. This timeline has serious issues already, mostly because the Saxon allies would not simply ignore an expansionist USSR encroaching into their territory. But it also addresses the fact that the German army would not have been strong enough to plausibly fight while being restricted by the Treaty of Versailles. Much like the first timeline, Britain does a limited peace of the Latin Axis in order to prevent having to fight 3 European powers on their own. But in this version of the timeline, we have an interesting dynamic emerging. The 3 powers of the Latin Axis would all have different designs on Germany. The most notable is that the Soviets would see the advantage of propping up a pan-German socialist state, which would cause harm to the French and Italian designs of having the realm shattered. But due to fascist chauvinism, France and Italy wouldn't be able to agree on the establishment of a fascist Germany. This would cause France and Italy to break with each other. Italy and France would both attempt to reach out to the Soviets and get them on their side. Italy would offer the Soviets all of Germany besides a buffer state of Austria. France would offer the same, but with a buffer state of the Rhine. I found it hard to determine which side the Soviets would take in this conflict, but in reality, the Soviets would take one side's deal and then turn on their former ally for the sake of spreading the worldwide revolution. At this stage of developing the timeline, I wasn't satisfied with either of these endings, especially as it felt to me that the Soviets would not have been able to achieve this level of success. It was at this point where I started to learn more of the different kinds of fascist collaborators of France, and of Marcel Déat, who was a former communist. This idea had sprung into an outcome where France manages to negotiate with Stalin, and the Italians turned on the French and Soviets alike. However, this shift of reactionary nationalism to a revisionistic socialism playing second fiddle to the Soviets would not be plausible without some sort of counterattack by the reactionary leagues. This would manifest into the French Civil War that triggers in episode 5 of the canon, and would also play into the decision to have Japan join the Saxon Allies instead of the Axis, like I had initially assumed. Due to me only initially considering the potential of Project Stresa to be a 3-episode series, I had only made a map focusing on Europe, with the rest of the world left completely ignored. As I began expanding the scenario, I had started to consider how the rest of the world would react, especially as the war in Europe had begun to manifest into a global conflict. Because of all this, I had assumed that Japan would align themselves with the Axis, as they had historically. However, after considering the chauvinism of the French and the Japanese ambitions on the southern resources, the Japanese ambitions to French Vietnam would need to be accounted for. Initial ideas had seen the French simply giving up Vietnam to Japan. This didn't seem plausible, as the rubber harvested in Vietnam was incredibly vital for the French military. The idea of a potential compromise between the Japanese and French had started to be considered, but this would have required someone who was willing to compromise with other leaders that did not share the idea of a French supremacy, which is basically none of the leaders in any of the leagues. While I eventually rejected this outcome in favor of a gradual entry of Japan into the Allies for the reasons listed above, let's consider this hypothetical Japanese entry into the Axis. Japan would be able to attack British Malaya, potentially going into the Netherlands earlier, bringing them into the war when they had managed to stay neutral at this point, and begin to put pressure on Australia, New Zealand, and the British Raj. The French and Japanese navies managing to contest the British all across the globe could play into a total Axis victory. But as the USA and Japan would still be strategic rivals in the Pacific, the USA would eventually join the war. The USA's concerns in Europe would eventually lead to them joining the Allies, like they had historically, and defeated the Axis, like they had historically. And while this would have been an interesting outcome, it didn't sit well with me, due to the fact that it ignored the strategic conflict that the Japanese would have with France, and also ignored the fact that Britain would obviously attack Vietnam to deny France their rubber. This is what brought me to the conclusion that the British would attempt to alleviate the pressure in their Pacific colonies by making concessions to Japan, convincing them to join the Saxon Allies. So now we've reached the most interesting decision in Project Stresa's canon. Japan is convinced to join the Saxon Allies, and the Latin Axis expand to include the Republic of China. This escalation of the conflict makes for an incredibly compelling scenario in Asia. Despite the fact that Japan would now need to be fighting a land war in Asia on 2 fronts, the potential for their victory is significant, but it had ignored several factors that would play against this outcome. The United States of America would have a lot of sympathy for China in their struggle for democracy. With Japan's invasion of Manchuria and invasion of China proper soon afterwards, the potential for Japan to gain the resources they needed and then to stage an invasion of the Philippines and Hawaii like they had in our history was a worry of the Americans. Therefore, they would covertly support the Chinese in their war against Japan, and would still embargo Japan for gaining American oil through trade like they had in our history. Not only would the Americans be directly instigating conflict with Japan in this scenario, but the Japanese rivalry between the Navy and the Army would be enough to cause significant concern. If Japan was managing to take China and invade the North, the resources that the Navy would covet in Southeast Asia would remain under the hands of rivals. Would the Navy of Japan truly sit idly by as they saw themselves slowly become a pawn of the British? These factors led to me making the controversial decision of having Japan bomb Pearl Harbor, and therefore bring the United States of America into conflict with the Saxon Allies, and become a member of the Latin Axis. But that wasn't always the case. If Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor, despite the rest of the Saxon Allies loathing this prospect, the obvious outcome is that the Saxon Allies would distance themselves with Japan, in an attempt to keep the peace between themselves and the Americans. But this action against a member of their alliance would cause the alliance to shatter. In the case of Britain and Germany, Britain may have been willing to compromise with Japan regarding their ambitions in China, but the Germans would never have been on board. This would cause a rift between the British and the Germans. With Japan attacking the USA, the British would have immediately had the concern of their empire to defend against the Americans. The obvious solution is to have Britain and Germany dump Japan and leave the Americans to destroy them. But what would that mean for the rest of the allied nations of the Saxon allies? Will they too be sold out to their adversaries when it was convenient for the major powers of the faction? Let's go with this hypothetical and say that the British and Germans throw Japan to the wolves. This scenario would then play out much like our history had. The Japanese would sign some sort of peace with the Soviets, potentially gaining the rest of Sakhalin and withdrawing their support of the Comintern. This would be a death knell for the Chinese and would lead to their subjugation. Next, the Japanese Navy would have been able to execute some of the important landings like they had historically, diverting more navies and armies away from the home front. The Soviets would no longer need to deal with their far eastern flank and would begin diverting resources to the west. Even without America not at war with Britain, it's unlikely that they would want to participate on their side, as up until that point, they were collaborating with Japan. There may be a limited support of the alliance through Lend-Lease, but the idea of throwing American lives into Europe to defend the empire that had just been aligning themselves with America's rival in the Pacific, when they had, decades earlier, arbitrated for the British to end their alliance with Japan, would be an extremely hard sell. It's hard to predict the exact outcome of this scenario, but a Latin Axis Comintern split Europe is likely, with the Italian dominance over the remaining nations possibly leading to a Latin Union led by Italy. But even then, that's an extremely gratuitous assumption, as it assumes that the Soviets wouldn't immediately turn on the fascists of Europe, who lack any strong benefactors like the United States in Project Stresa's canon. Basically, this is the ultimate Soviets win World War II scenario that anybody could ever conceive. There you go, everyone. I have a lot more ideas for Stresa outcomes that I'd like to share, but none that would be as plausible as these. These endings would be more like a Husavi Productions video where several endings are conceived with varying levels of plausibility. If you'd like to see something like that, leave a comment letting me know. Anyway, now that we've covered some of my ideas, I wanted to go over what you all had come up with. The first fan timeline that we're going to look into is Kurenai's 3 principles over the rising sun. The point of divergence is pretty solid. France decides to grant Japan Indochina in exchange for them attacking their rivals in the Pacific. As the story progresses, Brazil joins the war against the Latin Axis, around the same time as the USA. The Brazilians then help in key invasions to liberate Portugal and then advance into Iberia. Kurenai then has the CCP collaborating with the collaborationist Wang Jingwei under Stalin's orders in order to forge a Soviet-Japanese alliance. I'm just going to quickly say that I don't see this happening under any circumstances, but let's continue the review. The liberation of Portugal transitions into an invasion of Spain, where the Carlists betray Franco, taking over Spain, proclaiming the restoration of the monarchy, and joining the Saxon allies. It is a bit odd considering how anti-democratic the Carlists were, but sure. The French intervene, establishing a Spanish social republic. This dynamic also occurs in Italy, where the monarch removes Mussolini from power and joins the allies, with an Italian social republican puppet of France. This would be too much for the Latin Axis, which would lead to their defeat. Now the Saxon allies are only fighting the Soviets and Japan. Then, Kurenai shows Russia no mercy as 4 nuclear bombs are deployed against them. This leads to their utter collapse, with the Finnish uniting with the Estonians, annexing Leningrad, and establishing several buffer states. Then, not only do the Americans land in Japan, they also drop 4 nukes on them. This world can really never catch a break. Afterwards, tridomist regimes are established in Vietnam, Japan, and Korea, as, despite it all, the Kuomintang resisted the Japanese-Soviet attack and reasserted themselves in Asia, leading to this world. Overall, the scenario is interesting, but has some serious issues. For one, the KMT managed to survive a Japanese-Soviet onslaught that includes the Japanese seizure of Bengal. That, and the inexplicable by-point divergence additions, like the appointment of a monarchist as a vice president of Brazil, the overuse of nuclear strikes, and more. Regardless of my critiques, there is merit to this scenario, and as a cherry on top, there are some beautiful flags made by Kurenai. Overall, good job Kurenai, and thank you for participating. Up next, we have Detectives Pax Latina, touted as the TNO of Stresa. This one's pretty great. as it comes with a PowerPoint that we can review. Overall, a very interesting Latin Axis total victory scenario, with all the dynamics that you could ask for in a Cold War conflict. There isn't a single point of divergence in this timeline, as it follows the TNO model of everything went right for this country, which gives it a unique place among the top 3. I really like how this leads to a split China, Japan, and India, as it provides a very interesting dynamic between the European Latin axis, who may feel more endeared to fascism, and the Americans, who would feel more endeared to democracy, meaning that these countries in Asia would most likely be democratic leaning, while the fascists would be contained mostly in Europe and Africa. Overall, a very compelling scenario, worthy of its second place spot. Thanks for participating, Elective. And here we have our number 1. Our friend Serov has been a great advisor to me as I outlined the plot of German October. He shared with us his take on what a Latin Axis Comintern Cold War would look like. His primary point of divergence is that the French political crisis following Petain's assassination resolves with the establishment of a triumvirate between Diat, Doriot, and Larac, where each of them are granted major concessions. Despite France being split between 3 major factions, they prevent the collapse of their army, and therefore their front lines remain stable. The lack of a breakthrough against the French leads to them advancing further into German territory, diverting troops away from the Eastern Front, and granting the Soviet Union time to begin advancing on the Saxon allies with a successful Operation Bagration. This further collapse of the European theater caused Britain to retreat wholeheartedly from Asia. In response, Japan turned on the Saxon allies, seizing the resources of Southeast Asia and limiting Saxon allied oil supply. Regardless of these advances, Japan would follow the Americans, Soviets, and Chinese at the end of the conflict. The socialist cause would then spread to China and India, leading to the majority of Eurasia falling under communist influence. With the unprecedented rise of communism in Eurasia, the success of the Americans in Oceania, and the mainland Latin axis in Europe, who avoided America's liberalizing influence, we end up with these borders. Overall, a very well put together scenario by Serov. While I find that the sudden spread of socialism to China and India to be a little much, I do see the merit of this timeline being a Soviet supreme victory. So I take back the thing I said about that last timeline I made. Thank you to Serov for participating, and congratulations on winning this contest. Thank you again to all the participants, as all of them are really enjoyable to see. And thank you for watching this video. I didn't expect to feel nostalgic opening up my old Project Stresa files and editing them around, but I really don't miss my old workflow. It was way easier to work on Project Bourbon than it was with Project Stresa. Shout out to Enzo Rafael Souza Silva, Louis Avant, Kaiser Gaming, Drubs, and Solo Leo for being channel members. Thank you so much for your support. If you want to have your name shouted out at the end of my video, please consider supporting the channel by getting a membership. I've been making an active effort to be more present in my life recently, and I've had a lot of fun being able to be more present in the world. I would recommend you guys potentially put down the phone for a bit, maybe just like 5 minutes, no phone, 10 minutes, keep progressing. It's not good to stay online all the time. Unironically touch grass, and I hope you have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Please subscribe.
Stop.
Have a good day.
Day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.